Look, let me show you the best way to set up a super simple one-page vendor scorecard in Excel, just like the one that you see here, that people will find easy to use and understand without needing to be a spreadsheet wizard. And the good thing is it will take you about 10 to 15 minutes to set it up the first time. But once you've done that, you can reuse it again and again. So it will save you a ton of time in the long run. So if you're a project manager, it's more than likely you'll be working with external vendors and often involved in a vendor selection process. Now, choosing the right vendor can make or break a project. So this is where a vendor scorecard comes in very handy. So let's start with how I've set this scorecard up. Now you'll immediately see how simple this looks, and this is really by design. One of the biggest mistakes that I often see with vendor scorecards is that people create something far too complicated. They often end up building a massive spreadsheet that, on the surface, looks super analytical, but in practice is unwieldy, hard for people to understand, and actually doesn't capture the trade-offs one often has to consider in real-world vendor selection. So here's pro tip number 1 to kick things off. Keep things simple in order to focus on what matters. Let's first talk about the columns in the scorecard. Now in the first column, I have my criteria, which I've broken down into sub-criteria. This is the selection criteria that I'll use to score vendors on, and I'll say more about this later. In the second column, I have something called weightage, which is a weighting that I can apply to each sub-criteria. In the next 3 columns, I have the vendors that I'm selecting from. In this case, let's call them vendor 1, vendor 2, and vendor 3. My general recommendation is to evaluate from a short list of 3 to 5 vendors. And then in the final column, there's something very important called discussion points, which, as the name suggests, is a marker for topics of discussion later on. So that's all that we really need. Now, another mistake that I often see with vendor scorecards is simply having too many selection criteria. It really just becomes a laundry list, and what that tends to do is water everything down. As I mentioned earlier, the idea is to keep things simple so that you can focus on what matters. So my tip here is to have from 3 to 5 main criteria, which you can further refine into a number of sub-criteria. So let's look at the criteria that I have in my vendor scorecard. Now, you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. In my experience of working on IT projects, for example, there are usually 4 main criteria that you'd want to evaluate vendors on. The first is delivery capability, which is the ability of the vendor to do the job. The second criteria is proposed solution. Now, on IT projects in particular, you're not only selecting a vendor, but the solution that the vendor is offering. So it might be an accounting solution or a HR solution, for example. Now, the third criteria I have here is service, which refers to the level of service you believe you will receive from a vendor. And the fourth criteria is value. Now, this includes things like price, but I generally encourage people to look beyond price and think more about value for money. Now, each criteria is further broken down into sub-criteria, and in order to keep things manageable, I recommend keeping to a maximum of 6 sub-criteria. So let's walk through an example. Under the criteria of delivery capability, I have identified 4 sub-criteria, namely the industry track record of the vendor, relevant project experience, expert knowledge, and financial stability. Now, I've also given each sub-criteria a weightage of 25% each, which means all the sub-criteria are equally important. If one criteria is considered more important than another, I would give it a higher weightage, and I've set this up so that all the weights add up to 100%. Now, it's up to you to decide on the sub-criteria that are relevant for your particular project and to assign what you feel are appropriate weights. I would say agreeing on the criteria and sub-criteria is one of the key aspects of creating a vendor scorecard. Now, if you're doing similar kinds of projects, you will often use very similar criteria and sub-criteria, and this is where you can save time by reusing scorecards. So we're now at the point where we can start filling out the scores for each vendor according to the sub-criteria. I'm obviously working in percentages here. Now there are two ways to do the scoring. The first is as a group activity. The second is as an individual activity first, and then coming together as a group to compare scores. The second method is sometimes preferred as it avoids group bias. Now what often happens is that certain issues crop up that need further discussion or investigation. And this is where the discussion points column comes in so that those points can be captured. The other thing that you may have noticed is that a final score is calculated for each vendor for the criteria as a whole. And in the scorecard, I've set this up so that the highest score is indicated in green. Now, if you complete the vendor scoring for the rest of the criteria, you will end up with a complete scorecard. Just like you see here, you can see from the scorecard that each vendor has a total score for each of the 4 criteria. Now, the mistake that people sometimes make is to just add up the total scores, see which vendor has the highest, and hey presto, there's your winner. That's what I would consider a very algorithmic, almost robotic approach. And here's the thing, it ignores one of the most important aspects of vendor selection, which is discussing the trade-offs that one often has to consider in real-world vendor selection scenarios. Now, when we talk about projects and work that is more complex in nature, you will often find that the offerings of each vendors can be very different and quite diverse, and that's where you need to start discussing trade-offs. So, this is tip number 3. Understand the trade-offs between vendors and their offerings. So let's look at an example of trade-offs and how it shows up in a vendor scorecard. Now, you can see in this particular scorecard that for the criteria delivery capability, vendor 1 has the highest score by some margin. But in terms of proposed solution, this time it's vendor 2 that has the highest score, although vendor 1 is very close. But now look at the third criteria, service. And again, vendor 2 has the highest score, this time by some margin. And when we look at the final criteria, value, vendor 3 actually comes out on top, with vendor 2 not that far behind. So we have a situation here where there is no consistent winner, and where for different criteria, different vendors come out on top. And in my experience, having a situation where there are pros and cons with each vendor, rather than ending up with a vendor that is a clear winner, is a common thing. So this leads me on to my last tip. Tip number 4, which is look for deal breakers and deal makers. Now, in the process of scoring these vendors, you learn things along the way. So you might find out, for example, that for one particular vendor, there's a minimum 2-year contract that you have to sign up to. For some, that might be a deal breaker. Or you might find out that for one vendor, their solution can't be accessed from within the browser and has to be downloaded onto your computer. Again, that could be a deal breaker. Now, these things might not explicitly appear in your list of criteria, but you discover them during the process of vendor scoring or as you're researching more about the vendor. Now, by the same token, there could be something so compelling about a vendor's offering that it essentially is a deal maker for you. So this goes back to my earlier point. Vendor selection is not an algorithmic number crunching exercise. The vendor selection scorecard is a tool for helping you decide which is best suited for your specific project. Now, if you're interested in learning more about vendor management, check out some of my other videos here.